Hey, I'm Paul Perry,
I'm Kim Hartsock, and you're listening to The Wrap,
a Warren Averett podcast for business leaders,
designed to help you access vital business information and trends when you need it.
so you can listen, learn, and then get on with your day.
Now, let's get down to business. Glad to be back for another episode of The Wrap, and
Absolutely.
Today we are talking all things nonprofits. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and we have a couple of returning guests.
And for those that we are referencing another old episode. So if you remember back episode 16, we talked a lot about trying to find the best board of directors, and it was a great episode. And we were in person for that podcast down in Tampa. And
That's right.
Michelle is back with us today, as well as Jennifer Williams. Ladies, welcome to the podcast.
Good
Thank you,
afternoon,
Paul. Kim.
Kim.
I am Michelle Sanchez, as Paul said, and I'm a member here in our Tampa office of the firm. And my specialty is nonprofits, and that's a wide range of things within that nonprofit space. But I really love just being a business advisor and helping and supporting our clients as they further their mission in the community.
Jennifer, also, we have Jennifer Williams with us. Jennifer?
Yes, good afternoon, Jennifer Williams. I'm joining you from our Atlanta office. I've spent my career working with nonprofits, spent a lot of time working on single audits in the federal government awards space as well. So happy to join everyone this afternoon.
So, what are you seeing in terms of the challenges that the nonprofit leaders are facing right now? Maybe some of them are unique to nonprofits, and maybe you're seeing things that other businesses are seeing as well. But fill us in on what's going on right now in the industry.
I think I'll kick it off and then pass it to Jen. I think a lot of the things that, like you mentioned, we're seeing in nonprofits are things that a lot of companies are facing right now. One thing that we're hearing consistently is the labor challenges and kind of that war on talent, which has always been somewhat of an issue for nonprofits, but I think in the last couple of years that's really been amplified. Jennifer and I have spent a lot of time talking about that. Just, there's such a war for that talent right now. And in the past, we used to find that people had such a heart and passion for working with nonprofits that a little bit of that salary gap really didn't make a difference. They were committed to working and doing that, but as wages continue to rise, that gap gets bigger and bigger, and it's harder for a lot of those folks to justify staying. So we're seeing in our market a lot of turnover in nonprofits, and they're just having a tough time recruiting and retaining those positions.
Yeah, and I think, Michelle, we talked about, it's turnover at times where in the nonprofit industry, a lot of the talent stays for many, many years because they're just really dedicated to the mission. And you're seeing more turnover than normal in those positions. And so as we all know, having to retrain and find employees. And I think you had, a client tell you, and I've had the same, this is the best that I could hire for my budget. But when you're having to replace them and train them at times, need to start considering, do you need to be paying more, or, how to approach that, how to get a little creative there.
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about budgets. I can imagine funding and sources of funding is one of the other challenges you see. And can you kind of talk to what are you seeing your nonprofits that you talk to on a daily basis? What are they doing? Are they having to get creative? Kind of how do they solve that funding issue?
If we only had the one silver bullet for that, Paul, but that's a pretty complex issue. I think a lot of nonprofits got a little bit reliant on money coming in through the pandemic. Not only, need for services is higher than ever before, but we're seeing some of those sort of special circumstance funding, your PPP loans, your ERTC credits, which is a whole nother issue we can talk about. But, all the CARES Act funding, the PRF funding, for a couple of years, nonprofits were just getting money from a lot of different places. And unfortunately, some of those have been a little bit reliant on that funding. So now that we're coming out of the pandemic and that funding is going away, they're having to really look at kind of expanding and diversifying, but at the same time, staying true to their mission, to try to replace some of those funding sources, because the need didn't go away, but the funding dollars are starting to go away.
I would agree. And as far as getting creative, I think that looking at technology solutions is, a big place where our nonprofits are having to look, the type how you used to give has changed, and just being able to give through an app or, in other ways is becoming important. But with technology solutions is also coming cost,
Mm.
right? So there's a cost in investing in that technology that isn't something that necessarily was anticipated. So it's a, kind of a balance in figuring out how much technology to invest in. Because giving patterns have changed.
And Michelle, you alluded to this, but the CARES Act and the reporting that goes along with that,
Mhm.
it feels like the nonprofits over the past years have had more and more and more in terms of compliance. So
Mhm.
how are nonprofits dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And even for-profit companies that got federal funding that were never used to getting it, all of a
Mm.
sudden found themselves in this situation where they've got to, report and file and do all these compliance requirements. The risk is that we go back to kind of the turnover and the changes and all this funding and compliance that you have people in those positions that really aren't as experienced as maybe you want them to handle that reporting and compliance. So it is definitely a risk to make sure that you're, doing everything. And I have some clients in that sort of, especially in that medical space or healthcare space, that they got money, from PRF and some of the CARES Act without even asking for it. So, it's like, okay, we have the money, now we have to figure out how to spend it. So, they needed to be really careful about what they're spending it on and making sure that they are hitting those compliance requirements. For your kind of seasoned nonprofits that are used to having those single audits and compliance reporting, not as big of a deal, as sort of the ones that were under the radar before that now all of a sudden have found themselves in that position.
You mentioned ERTC, Michelle. I mean, that's got to, everybody's hearing that lately. How is that impacting nonprofits specifically, or is it pretty much the same as all other industries?
I've seen it similar in other industries, and that saying "it's too good to be true." Sometimes it is with the ERTC credits. Now, there's a lot of companies that qualify, either through the lost revenues or the government mandated shutdowns. But as you all know, there's a lot of firms out there pushing these ERTC credits because they're getting an upfront contingent fee and saying, hey, we can get you a $4 million ERTC credit, where they're not really taking the time to dig into the details of, does that government shutdown really apply, to the rules? And I think, when you're looking at having a lack of funding, if someone comes to you and says, hey, we can qualify you and you can get a $4 million, most companies are going to say, okay, yeah, let's do it. And I think they just need to be careful because
Mm.
if you're not certain and have your documentation and really have vetted that thoroughly, that's a liability. You may have to pay that money back, even if you get the money. It's open to a 7-year period of being audited, and if you have to pay it back, that's interest and penalties. The IRS has put notices out there to kind of tell people to be careful and look out for these schemes. Jennifer, are you seeing the same in your client base?
Yeah, I
As
actually
well.
got the first email from a client last night, where they hired someone else to do the ERTC work. They were kind of aggressively pursued, and an IRS agent actually showed up, to ask some questions. So I think it's definitely beginning.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think personally, if I'm getting calls on my personal cell phone, 5 times a week that I qualify for an ERTC credit, that should give people a little bit of pause and just like blindly, following these companies that are out there doing it.
Want to receive a monthly newsletter with wrap topics?
Then head on over to warrenaverett.com/the wrap and subscribe to our email list to have it delivered right to your inbox.
Now, back to the show. We've talked a lot about the challenges that are facing the industry. What would your advice be to the leaders of these nonprofits? What should they be focused on? What should they be really spending their time on?
I think one thing, Kim, is strategy, kind of taking a step back. We all kind of took an internal look at our own lives during the pandemic and, how can we change? How can we do things better? How can we do things different? I think a business, for-profit, nonprofit is no different. It's a good time to kind of really look at what you're doing. Look at what you're doing well and what's impactful to your mission, sort of looking at those, kind of 4 quadrants where you have high impact, high mission related, high profit, or the opposite, low profit, low impact, and focus on the things that you do well and that are aligned with your mission. When you kind of have to look at expenses, you really need to be focusing your costs and expenses on things that are A, going to be profitable, and B, that are in alignment with your mission. So it's a good time to kind of step back and do a reset, look at your overall strategy, make that strategy and planning part of your annual process or your annual strategic meetings so that you're always sort of moving ahead. And it's easy to chase the dollars. A lot of times you'll see nonprofits, hey, they may make a lot of money doing something that's totally not aligned with their mission. People are looking at that. Donors, funders, they want to make sure that you're kind of walking the walk and talking the talk. So making sure you're focusing on what aligns with your mission. And if there's something that's really high impact but not very profitable, figure out how you can make that profitable. And if you can't, consider, do we need to keep doing this? So I just think it's a good time in this environment to take a step back and reassess, what you're doing and where you're going.
And I think a lot of nonprofits are really, and as they should be, focused on ratios. They're focused on how much am I spending of the dollar on programming versus how much am I spending on, this management and general bucket, and looking at the ratios. But I think that, as part of that process, like Michelle said, really looking at how do we align our mission and where do we spend our dollars, and really using and, harnessing that technology to be able to tell your story. It's told in a way other than ratios, and really using technology and the way to reach people, which is different now, to tell your story.
And I just kind of piggyback off Jennifer, just kind of telling your story. That's really important. And that's what's going to reach funders and donors today. And a lot of nonprofits are going, to use some type of impact report, almost similar to what, for-profit companies might be thinking about. We've all heard of ESG and kind of that governance and who you are and your mission and what you do. That's a good tool for nonprofits to start thinking about. And maybe not full ESG, but looking at an impact report and how do I tell the story of what we do and what really matters. It's not about this ratio, but how many meals are we serving? How many people are we serving? That's what people want to know, and that's what people want to give to, the folks that are kind of following their mission in that footsteps.
So here on the wrap, we like to wrap it up in 60 seconds or less. What's that one thing you want our listeners to think about, remember from this discussion as it relates to nonprofit industries, kind of their challenges, their opportunities to overcome in today's world?
I would actually say 2 things. And one we kind of touched on is really your mindset. Nonprofit is not no profit. It's a tax exempt status. So, making sure you're thinking about it like a business, but still staying true to your mission, I think is key. And then also just kind of, stepping back, focusing on your mission, telling your story, getting your story out there about what you do and who you are. And, don't be afraid to reassess that in challenging times. You got to sometimes make some tough decisions. And just, it's like I said, it's a great time to reset.
Yeah, I would agree. It's hard to beat that, Michelle, but I go back to just taking a step back and realizing that things have changed, and that, what was done a few years ago is different now, and really just looking at those, technology solutions, people solutions, and really, again, changing your mindset.
Well, thank you both for joining us today. It was great to have you on, and great to see you. And Paul and I will look forward to the next episode to see our listeners then.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, guys.
And that's a wrap. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a review on your streaming platform. To check out more episodes, subscribe to the podcast series, or make a suggestion of other topics you want to hear.
Visit us at warrenaverett.com/the wrap.